This session is chaired by Waltzing Head. So,
welcome back. Since Joachim von Braun is not here, who would normally chair this session, I took on the role to moderate. And what we have to do now in the following hour, more or less, is to come at the final draft for our session to summarize. So what we did throughout the meeting is we took notes, we formulated a draft. You have it on your desk now. And I will briefly explain how we did it and what is in there. And then I propose that we grant us something like 10 minutes of reading. And then if you have points that you really disagree with or that you feel that are actually missing, we should discuss them and then complement this draft, so that at the end of the meeting we have something that we can pass on and that we can agree upon. Are you happy with this procedure? Fine, thank you. So what we did, a general comments on science and society. I think this is not problematic because there was consensus throughout the meeting. Then we tried to identify emerging insights that came out of our discussions. So summarizing groundbreaking developments in the main disciplines of basic sciences. This was the Studium Generale that we all went through. Then to search for evidence-based and sustainable problem-solving strategies and the ensuing research in favor of people's well-being, poverty reduction, and current problems of environmental destruction and conflicts. And then finally, approaches on how to strengthen society's trust in science. What you will then find is our discussions on frontiers in the various scientific disciplines. And we asked colleagues to provide paragraphs for the specialities, so if you have a brief look. We will certainly have to complement this with a paragraph on education, which we have not included yet. And then at the end of this draft paper, we produced a few bullet points concerning the opportunities that we have for consultation among the leaders of science organizations, policymakers, and the religious communities and academicians in order to translate actually the results that basic science or the issues that basic science can contribute to society. So if you think that 10 minutes are fine for reading, then I would just shut up and give you the time to study this little document.
Can I suggest one thing?
Yeah.
Is some person can read also, because we have the translation in Spanish, if someone read all the text. So
excuse me, I didn't know
maybe,
this.
I don't know if you want to read. Oh, Gabriela. So one English is matter, language English, we hear, where here. To speak well English is some from London? Yeah. Okay. Or maybe Consul Magno, do you want to read the text? Eh? Okay, thank you.
This is my first time at seeing some of it too. So, the conclusions of the 2018 plenary. Transformative roles of science in society, from emerging basic science towards solutions for people's well-being. Science and technology impacts on society, but society also influences science. The direction and emphasis of scientific development is influenced by accepted social views and values. Priorities are influenced by majority views and by special interest groups. The Pontifical Academy of Sciences has addressed in various conferences and publications the serious threats to humanity caused by nuclear war risk, environmental hazards such as climate change, loss of biodiversity, and pollution. The Academy has, at the same time, pointed toward opportunities arising from science to counter these threats and to enhance health and well-being. This statement by the Pontifical Academy of Sciences is based on its plenary conference of 2018 and takes note of some trends in society and science and shares scientific insights on key risks of humanity and science opportunities to address them. Frontiers in main scientific disciplines are highlighted, and potential action items emerging from science policy consultations are derived. The purpose of this statement is to stimulate thought and action for more fruitful exchange among science and society. In that context, we also embraced the theme of how to foster fruitful relations between science and religion. On science and society, number one, both societal change and scientific changes occur more and more rapidly, and the two are interlinked. The PAS notes that these interlinked changes require responsible engagement by science communities. Science is part of society and must not view itself as a separate community in society. Number two, global change is increasingly impacted by human actions, but appropriate and comprehensive responses to the Anthropocene's risks for planetary health are at least in part missing. Science has progressed with identifying these risks, but needs to focus further on identifying and implementing solutions and their complexities. Number three, while acknowledging the limits of science to predict the future, even for science itself, let alone for big societal changes, foresight into risks and opportunities in the long-term future is needed. Intensified interaction between science and society and trust in science are needed in order to identify large global risks and opportunities, and the roles of science and technologies in addressing them rationally, with wisdom, and collectively. Number four, science must constantly earn its trust by society. Trust in science seems to decline, while change in society is increasingly science-driven, and knowledge about science is growing among world populations. Loss of trust in science will lead to reduced science support by society and jeopardizes the transformative impact that science has on innovation and technology. Our Academy is particularly sensitive to any such tendencies and therefore seeks the dialogue with science policy leaders. Transparency is imperative in such a dialogue. Number five, we note that freedom of thought is fundamental for societal well-being, including minorities, and freedom of sciences is fundamental for science to identify new truths and facilitate progress with responsibility. The PAS is an independent body within the Holy See and appreciates freedom of research. The PAS has as its goal the promotion of the progress of the sciences and the study of related epistemological questions and issues. Number six, the discourse between science and society would be endangered if equality of rights is not assured, including equal rights of women and men and children's rights. Science must get involved in this discourse, foster understanding of the barriers, and drive changes needed to overcome human trafficking, modern slavery, and abuse. Number seven, there is progress in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, but the targets for overcoming hunger and high mortality are not going to be achieved unless a major change in course of action is taken. Laudato Si has made key proposals for that. Science needs to accept being put to task to outline and develop actions at global and national levels as well as in societies. Inclusion of youth is key for that. Selected insights from sciences to address humanities' challenges. In the 2018 PAS plenary sessions, we identified emerging insights from basic science and connect insights from basic sciences with visions for problem-solving strategies and related research. We aimed to identify, number one, groundbreaking developments in the main disciplines of basic science. Number two, evidence-based and sustainable problem-solving strategies and related research for people's well-being, poverty reduction, and humanity's current problems of environmental destruction and conflicts. Number three, approaches on how to strengthen society's trust in science. Highlights of the PAS plenary themes are frontiers in science disciplines, astronomy, space. Thanks to improved instruments in space and on the ground, cosmologists can trace the history of our expanding universe back to the first nanosecond. This progress brings into focus new questions. What generated the observed mix of atoms, dark matter, and radiation? Was our Big Bang the only one? And the realization that there are billions of Earth-sized habitable planets orbiting stars within our galaxy has initiated a vibrant new research effort, linking astronomy more closely with biology and environmental science. Physics. Physics, the most exact and quantitative of the natural sciences, continues to expand its reach and to contribute to the development of understanding and enabling tools in many other areas of science, from astrophysics to biochemistry and medicine. At the most fundamental level, physics tries to model the basic constituents of matter and their interactions. Experiments at high particle energies or with extreme precision are probing conceivable limits of the standard model. Precise measurements of fundamental constants are making it possible to redefine the basic units of measurements so that man-made artifacts can be entirely avoided. The laws of quantum physics have led to a far-reaching understanding of atoms, molecules, and condensed matter, and they have enabled past transformative inventions such as the transistor, the laser, or magnetic resonance imaging. Quantum physicists are now beginning to harness counterintuitive quantum phenomenon such as entanglement to engineer new quantum technology. Envisioned goals include highly sensitive and accurate sensors for forces and fields, secure unbreakable communication, and quantum information processing. Quantum computers and quantum simulators will enable new approaches to the modeling and understanding of complex systems such as high-temperature superconductors that are outside the reach of classical computers. Biology. Advances have occurred recently in biological sciences that are highly significant toward improving people's health and well-being. Some aspects of these progresses will be discussed in this section, such as the case of the identification of stem cells and of their role in development in the process of cell renewal of adult tissues and of their potential for regenerative medicine. The production of a drug against multiple sclerosis is a spectacular example of the direct translation of basic research into medicine. Another highlight of the application of research to human health concerns the progress in cancer treatment by immunotherapy, together with the hope of novel approach directly derived from recent results in cell biology. The importance of technical improvements in the process of discovery will be underlined. Taking as an example the spectacular explosion of new microscope technologies, the progress in genomics, big data, and a project for a genome information-oriented society are also spectacular. Finally, attention will be called on the necessity of an ethical attitude in the application and use of these spectacular scientific advances. Biochemistry, genetics, and chemistry. While basic science discovers the new, scientists in general are finding immediately applications for those fundamental concepts, and that normally corresponds to a solution of important problems. The understanding of cell differentiation in stem cells has become the main issue to reach the cure of degenerative diseases. Humans are living more, and due to the understanding of basic biochemical concepts, they are also living better. New and modern interdisciplinary findings are now being applied to the diagnostic and treatment of cancer. The idea to make modern health techniques available to all is one of the goals of science. While fundamental science evolves, society can have hope for solutions to fundamental problems like adequate food production and better preservation of the earth as an all. Science and society are today in a tangled configuration, one being very much dependent on the other. Medicine and brain. The past decade has seen major breakthroughs in the therapy and even cure of previously fatal diseases, all of which were the consequence of applications of curiosity-driven scientific discoveries to medical problems. Examples are the treatment of hepatitis C, the development of vaccines against Ebola, the ability to stabilize and sometimes even cure patients infected with HIV virus, the successes to repress, sometimes even cure, cancer by combining immunotherapy and genetic engineering with the classical approaches, and the greatly improved success of organ transplantation. Much less progress has been made in the treatment of the major psychiatric diseases. The main reason is the still sparse knowledge about the neuron mechanisms underlying higher cognitive functions. Major challenges are the immense complexity of the nervous system and the fact that its functions are determined not only by genetic, but to a large extent also by epigenetic shaping. Here, the specific problem is that environmental influences comprise not only biological factors such as nutrition or toxins, but to a substantial extent also socio-cultural conditions. More progress has been made with respect to the substitution of impaired sensory and motor functions using neuronal prostheses or brain-machine interfaces, and here is space for promising improvements. To alleviate the symptoms of Parkinson's disease, deep brain stimulation with implanted electrodes is now applied in hundreds of thousands of patients. And attempts are also underway to use this invasive technique to alleviate psychiatric symptoms. As interference with brain functions, whether with pharmacological, surgical, or electrical means, often alters not only motor functions, but affects also higher cognitive functions and traits of personality, strict ethical control of such interventions is required, but not always implemented. Novel ethical challenges are also created by the progress in reproductive medicine, cloning, gene therapy, and mitochondrial diseases. and with the introduction of the CRISPR-Cas technology that permits shortcuts to gene editing and gene therapy. As science is international, it is an obligation of the scientific community to make this need transparent and strive for widely accepted international regulations. Science addressing large humanities issues and their underlying causes. Climate change, energy, sustainability. The new science of climate extremes has made it possible to link weather extremes to climate change. During the next 25 years, intensification of weather extremes due to climate change can expose more than 1.5 billion people, 20% of the population, to deadly heat stress and other attendant health risks. While the poorest among us, numbering over 3 billion, are the most vulnerable, climate change has now the potential to adversely impact the wealthy, too, in the form of intense fires, floods, and droughts. Many solutions are still available to avert catastrophic impacts. The fundamental challenge is to garner massive public support for climate actions. The PAS can help immensely by forging an alliance between leaders in science, public health, policymakers, and leaders of all faiths. The glue for such an alliance is the knowledge that both science and religion agree on protecting creation, nature, including the 7.5 billion people, and the knowledge that because of our inaction to mitigate climate change, change has become a huge moral, ethical issue. Health, well-being of population. Healthcare is a universal right as recognized by the United Nations Charter. Quote, the economic, social, and cultural rights recognized in Articles 22 to 27 include the right to social security, the right to work, the right to equal pay for equal work, the right to rest and leisure, the right to a standard of living adequate for health and well-being, the right to education, and the right to participate in the cultural life of the community, end quote. Science develops the data from which the template, protocol, standards of healthcare are derived. The process of standardizing protocols of treatment is a matter of science to curtail subjective variations without a scientific basis. Antimicrobial therapy is an illustration of scientific derivation of efficacy targeted to specific pathogens. Ecology and biosystems, including opportunities of genetics. Knowledge on evolution of the universe, of living organisms, and of living conditions calls for and offers opportunities to safeguard a rich biodiversity. The interdependence of different species of living organisms requires also efforts to safeguard a rich biodiversity. Opportunities for consultations among leaders of science organizations, policymakers, religious communities, and academicians. Taking note of the transformative roles of science in societies, key science policy issues addressed in the consultations were, number one, scientific inquiry is constitutive for human culture and has a moral value in itself. As long as mankind actively and intentionally interferes with the world, it is a moral obligation to strive for an evidence-based model of the world, as this is the only safe way to judge the consequences of actions. Number two, as discoveries are, per definition, hard to anticipate, and as many of them are actually serendipitous, it is epistemically questionable to identify priorities for science inquiry solely as a function of short-term applicability. A better investment would be to create conditions that enhance creativity and encourage curiosity-driven science. Number 3, ex ante identification of promising fields of science remains difficult, yet science policy and related financing constantly needs to make related decisions. Bold decisions under science uncertainty are called for to address the risky and uncertain global changes. Broadly fostering creativity through science education must be a priority. Number 4, science policy's choices require consideration of moral dimensions. Science communities need to actively engage in shaping and promoting evidence-based worldviews, and in doing so, we see synergies between free and responsible science and religion. Religion harvests and concentrates the collective experience of populations about rules of moral conduct that are helpful to support peaceful coexistence and thus contributes empirical evidence on the validity of moral rules that is complementary to the evidence provided by science. Number 5, joint action to enhance trust in sound science. Science and science policy makers need to engage with society to foster trust in science and patiently counter the spread of statements that are grossly distorting realities. Causes of possibly growing mistrust in science are to be addressed, and opportunities to enhance trust in science identified, including science education and communication. Number 6, sharing of science that can help to address global risks across countries for collective action. We note that science itself and its benefits for humanity are not shared sufficiently across nations. As science is fundamental for humanity, this inequality is an ethical issue of growing importance. Developing countries need to be actively included in the advanced international science systems. Number 7, science is partly to be viewed as a public good, not only a factor in nations' competitiveness. This especially applies to basic science. The societal and policy demands for short-term translational science need to be critically evaluated and must not marginalize the focus on basic sciences that usually pays off only in the long run. Final remarks. Following recommendations of His Holiness Pope Francis on his address to the members of the Academy and the guests, we are identifying insights that emerge from basic and applied science and have linked them with strategic visions in order to study relevant problems for improving society and well-being. Members of the Academy left the meeting convinced that with determination and ethics, much of the desired outcome can be achieved.
Thank you very much. Very good.
Thank you so much. It really changes if you read it and hear it from a native speaker. Yeah, we noticed. So, as already mentioned, we are certainly lacking a paragraph on education, partly because this was only the topic of this morning's session. We will add that. Martin Rees also noticed something that was missing. If you would take the word.
Yes. We had two, I thought, very interesting papers yesterday from Martin Sweeting and Will Marshall on the practical use of space, because it can now use very small satellites much more cheaply. And I think perhaps in the application section, rather than in the astrophysics section, one could say something like, an exciting development is the availability of cheap miniaturized satellites, enabling monitoring of land use and urban development, and bringing internet access to undeveloped and isolated regions, something like that, because I thought that was those were two very good and interesting presentations yesterday.
Yeah. So, now, you were first, then...
Sorry, one thing.
Oh, okay, let's go. Yes, you were first. Oh, no, you were even...
In the program, made by the president from Brown, say, Martin Rees, Van der Leyen, and Theodore, maybe they can explain the different parts, no? Because say, new insight from basic sciences, because the reduction of this are made by these people, so maybe they can say something about this part, no? I don't know. What is your idea?
Basically, what we have to say is in the text, Marcello.
Okay, you already write it.
I think most of it is incorporated,
Yeah,
but you are, of course, free to raise your hands and
It's
make
integrated.
additional
Okay.
comments, but I would rather prefer to have the audience at large now contribute, because we had the chance to discuss among each other in the council.
Yes, of course. But I want to say something in general also. I think that we need to put something about the city, because the speaker of the cardinal was very important in the sense that all these problems are some concentration in the cities, and the population go more and more to the cities. So we need to say this is a fact, and maybe also we can make the advertise that say the professor to try to create new kind of cities, more intelligent and more rational. So I don't know, but the question of city is very important for me, and we need to add something, because we also study here this question. Thank you.
Okay. Note is taken. Now, let's proceed, please.
Okay, thank you. Basically, a great summary of a great session, so thank you to whoever worked a long time between the talks and now. 3 short observations just to keep it scientific. I think twice in the thing there is the statement made that trust in science is or may be declining. Empirically, there's been very careful science done on that, and that is not true. Trust in science has been one of the most constant, sustained, and high levels of trust in any profession around the world in all the social surveys done. So I think everything that says we need to continuously earn the trust that society places in us, and that becomes especially important in areas of high social controversy, whether that is birth control or stem cells or climate. But it would be a shame if this academy were to simply state something that the empirical evidence would refute, which would be the declining trust as a general phenomenon. The second one is not an empirical difference. It is that throughout this meeting, the only thing that I've just found objectionable as a sometimes student of science and technology policy and budgeting is making the tone of making the investment in curiosity-driven research versus investments in other forms of science and technology an either-or statement. It must be uncontroversial that we need to balance those, that we need to rigorously preserve a space for curiosity-driven blue sky research, but that exactly the consequence of our dialogue, of the many speakers who have spoken to the need to build trust, build dialogue with society, is we equally need to be engaging in directing some of that science to problems that people feel are urgent sources of fear or hope in their lives. And it just seems a gratuitous blunder to install in the middle of this report a fight over either or, when very modest parts of the language could simply say, let's not go overboard on either side. Otherwise, a great report. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. We will tune these sentences. I think one reason why we had this emphasis on curiosity-driven science was that it was a shared feeling that trust in science is actually decreasing. If there is a scientific evidence against it, this is accepted. But we also felt that one reason why we had the feeling that we lose trust is that the necessity to justify scientific proposals for grants and for ethical approval always had to use application founded justifications. And that misled us to produce justifications that were actually taken out of the blue air. And since these promises had not been fulfilled, we lost credibility. But we will make a better equilibrium, for sure. Thank you. So I have to follow the sequence. I think it was Carey, then
Clark.
Raven, then Schellnhuber, and then you.
Could you write a text?
Me?
Congratulations for a remarkable text. I'm just a little, I regret the absence of mathematics in the list of disciplines, physics, medicine, etc. There is no mathematics. Mathematics is extremely important. Second point, you will not be surprised that I regret the absence of the word science education. And third point is about religion. It seems in this report that religion is only a kind of morality. Religion harvests, etc., the moral rules. I think that religion, as compared to science, is much more. I think that religion is to mysteries what science is to problems. And this should be perhaps the reality, the essence of religion is not very well stated here as just being a kind of new morality. Thank you.
So I noticed you wanted to comment on this, but maybe I can follow the sequence. Next was Dr. Raven.
The report seems to me is a good one for the scientific matters that were discussed in the meeting, but as you would know from my paper and my statements yesterday, I think it needs a much stronger introduction to pose the problem of what is going on in the world and why these things are necessary. Otherwise, it's like a report on where science is now, which could have been issued in 1500 or 1800, and there would have been more time to implement them. But in a world where we're using, according to Global Footprint Network, 175% of total sustainable productivity now, where we have 2 billion people lacking at least one micronutrient and 800 million people going to bed hungry every night, the 8 richest people in the world owning as much money as the 3.6 billion poorest, biological species going extinct at an unprecedented rate. And biological extinction is barely mentioned in here, and yet as several of us pointed out, it's an absolutely irreversible problem, completely contrary to the precepts in the Bible and completely unacceptable, that will limit our future irreversibly if we don't attend to it. The 2.3 billion people being added to the world population in the next 30 years are going to be mainly in developing countries. It seems to me we have to strengthen the introduction if we want to be realistic about why we're arguing for all of this, and think about it in terms of what we can accomplish in a world where There are 220,000 more of us every day, most of them coming into a world hungry and without much opportunity, and where sustainability is running out, and where we're exhausting the very biodiversity that supports us. In the same way, I think the last paragraph, it's I think not appropriate for us to sound less urgent than His Holy Father in talking about the condition of the world. And certainly both in encyclical Laudato Si and in his remarks to us yesterday, he posed a very urgent picture of what was going on and a very real need for responding to it. To talk about all of these wonderful advances without talking about the challenges a little more explicitly, and without talking about our chances of implementing them and spreading them around in a world where selfish nationalism has become the norm, I think has them a little bit floating in space. And I think we would want to root them better, perhaps refer to our own symposium on biodiversity extinction and its consequences and so forth. I think we would want to root them better and give them more traction and more reality in terms of what we really can hope to do. Otherwise, it's written as if we would have a period of 30 years to start implementing all these things, and then they would be applied to all the problems, and then things would get better. But in fact, it's a matter of numerical observation that the problems are cascading down on us, and implementing any one of them in time to make a real difference is going to be very difficult. And so I would like to see in this very good summary of the proceedings a much better sense of that come into the picture.
Marcello, directly to this, and then Herr Schellnhuber.
Peter, could you draft briefly your suggestion? Thank you.
Fine. Herr Schellnhuber.
Yeah, now it works. Thank you. Now, first of all, I'd like to echo completely what Peter Raven put in such exquisitely clear terms. So I would say we'll have him draft a paragraph which would have an impact first on the introduction, but as well as on the final sentences, and I will come back to that a little bit later. So first of all, I would also like to support what Marcelo Sanchez-Sorondo said about the cities, the megacity problem, the polycentricity. We had Professor Boone-Falleur was referring to that, the Cardinal was, I think that was a very important contribution, so we should reflect it. Second remark I'd like to make is on climate change. Obviously, I gave a paper on that. And there is now a very wordy sort of reflection on that we are now able, much better than before, to link extreme events to climate change. But that is almost a trivial thing. We know this by thermodynamics. I think this has been exaggerated in importance. While I was referring to, and Steve Chu was referring to that and others, that actually we might push the Earth into a completely different state of operation, mode of operation. And so I give you just an example. I formulated a sentence already, so which would mean new research has also identified the risk of irreversible change that might push the planet into a so-called hothouse state. And you know, this was the paper we published in August, and it is probably the most the most highlighted paper which we had across the disciplines this year, and it made a huge wave around the planet. It was reflected in hundreds of outlets, so we should not ignore that. So this is the sentence I will propose at the appropriate place. The third remark, actually, I was very impressed what Dr. Moncada said yesterday when we talk about cancer research. Cancer research is pushing the limits, it's fantastic, it's admirable, but whom is it serving? It may just serve the most advanced approaches in immunotherapy, just the richest people on this planet, while he argued very convincingly that 60% of cancer research, of cancer cases might be avoided by better behavior, by better nutrition, by giving up smoking and so on. So I think the investment, given the yardstick of human life and human misery, the investment, I think, are quite misguided. So we should emphasize, if we reflect moral dimensions at all, when the science policy choices may not be the right one. So I think we should refer to that in the paragraph. And the fourth is actually echoing what Peter Raven just said. Wherever we look, whether it's biodiversity, whether it's climate change, whether it's the growing gap between the rich and the poor, whether it's public health, whether it's nuclear arms proliferation again, I think we cannot just end with the sentence that member of the Academy left the meeting convinced that with determination and ethics, much of the desire can be achieved. I'm not convinced of that, actually, not at all. I'm deeply concerned. I will leave this meeting again with deep concerns about the future of humanity, and we should not fall back behind the Laudato Si. So we should say we are deeply concerned, we leave this meeting deeply concerned, yet we hope very much that with better investment in science and policy and reflecting the moral dimensions, we still hope that we will overcome this planetary crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Points well taken. Would you mind rephrasing a few of those things so that we can just incorporate them if there is no opposition to this opinion?
I would like to underscore it, actually.
Okay, good. So may I pursue the list?
About the question of alimentation, we have a very good statement, the recent meeting that we organized with von Braun. So maybe we can take for the question of diet, some of this sentence of our president statement.
Yeah, for sure we should, important. Both in the introduction and at the end, express our concerns more explicitly. Now, I have Archbishop as the next, then I have you, then Jane, and there was, okay. Virtually everybody. So.
Thank you. Just a few points, some of them really minor, some of them, one of them a little major. I think look over the style. Sometimes we speak of science as science itself doing something. Science is part of society, yes, and must not view itself as a separate community. I guess that's more about scientists than about science, just a minor point. Then there is a good sentence on page, what would that be, 3, under biochemistry, genetics, and chemistry. The last sentence says, science and society are in a tangled configuration, one being very much dependent on the other. And that's probably true of more than just biochemistry, genetics, and chemistry, where it's now, so it should be moved. Then when referring to the Sustainable Development Goals, that's bullet point 7 on page 2, we only list the targets for overcoming hunger and high mortality. And I'm just wondering why we, out of 17 goals, just single out overcoming hunger and then overcoming high mortality. Anyway, mortality is going to be 100%, whatever we do. But maybe that should be rephrased. Then I notice in the section on opportunities for consultations, a tension that probably is true, but the way it's worded, it seems that we're not quite aware of the tension. Bullet point 1 says that to strive for an evidence-based model of the world is the only safe way to judge the consequences of actions. And then in point 3, we say, bold decisions under science uncertainty are called for to address the risky and uncertain global changes. So both is true, but it just seems that we're not aware that we're saying both things. And then my final and major point, of course, concerns religion. I'm grateful for your comment earlier. I would oppose reducing religion to providing just those moral considerations that you can either take or leave. Religion is much more than that. In fact, the moral considerations are an outcome of an analysis well done, of discernment well done, and also you can never take away this dimension of meaning making that comes with religion. And I think that is the broader context that allows us to put down our food and say, this is a moral statement that we should abide to. So I think the framework that I tried to present yesterday in terms of resilience, coexistence, and hope, that is much more than just putting some moral sugarcoating on things. So I think we should say something more here.
Yeah. Would you formulate this paragraph anew and hand it in so we can incorporate it?
I was dreading that you were saying that.
Well, I appreciate what you said. Just a comment. I look science very important for the whole population on our planet. That means worldview, scientifically proper worldview. And this doesn't only concern the scientists. So you have to be careful. I do like, depending on the text, to have the word science rather than scientists.
Yeah, to follow I think it was you and then Jane.
I think this is a very interesting report. I think you guys worked very hard, put it together, so I think we have to add. I just want to make a point that when you discuss the science, you go by discipline. And I want to point out the main problems we are talking about in areas like climate change, health, energy. These are interdisciplinary problems. These are not one discipline problems. These are disciplines working together. We are not going to solve these problems without having all the sciences coming together in terms of facing the problem. So we are much more oriented towards problem than disciplines. An idea is, in particular, on the academy, when we have a powerhouses of people of different talents, on each of these problems you looked at. Climate change and health were sort of main problems here together with astronomy, stuff like that. You have to bring all this talent together to address how we solve them. The second thing is, I think people are talking about empirical data and observation. But the observation today, we are not dealing with simple problems. We are dealing with very complex problems. We are dealing with large quantity of data. So as observed universe in all these problems, again, health, climate, and things like that, we're dealing with large quantities of data, so we're facing with big data, and we don't comment about how we deal with big data. As you look here, there are several side comments during this meeting, but not precise comments. I think I spoke a little bit, other people, when they're talking about cancer, spoke a little, brought this up. But the idea is, if you're doing with big data, there's also a relationship between experiments and theory and computation. And so in a sense, you have to, and it's very hard to look at big data just at vacuum. You have to have some model. So you look at big data, you try to extract the information from big data under some model, you make some predictions, this prediction can be tested experimentally, so there is this feedback between theory and computation and experiments, and I think it has to be highlighted as we go together. I think the problems are well identified, but people use many words like holistic, complex system, and that's true. That's the reality of this problem. So the synergy has to be put together, and we always should remember that the great thing about having academy with all this talent in the house, they can bring all this talent together to address these problems. The topics were perfect, but really we have to re-stress they're not physics, mathematics, or chemistry or biology. They're really hard problems when you bring all the talent together, and also the need of the coupling between experimental science and theory and computation, not as two different things, not like working separately or trying to explain each other, but actually working synergistic to find a solution for these problems. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would you like to write something? Brief, because we won't be able to have very long statements included. Jane Lubchenko, please.
There's a well-known phenomenon for what's happening around the room, which is when someone makes a comment, they get a new task. And the label that's often given to this is that the spouting whale gets the harpoon. So, just an observation, folks. So, but seriously, my thanks as well to the drafters of this. In addition to some of the comments that have already been offered, I would note that relative to the Sustainable Development Goals, that achieving, I believe we need to achieve all of them to achieve any of them, that it's not possible to do just one or two. And so in addition to noting that they are all important, it's the connections across them that are important to also emphasize. In other words, if we just take them as siloed, 17 silos, that misses the opportunity to connect the dots across them, and that's where the major benefit is going to happen. And that's particularly relevant when it comes to the biodiversity, Sustainable Development Goals 14 and 15 in the ocean and on land, because that is not only part of our moral responsibility as stewards, as per Laudato Si, but also a key to achieving ending poverty and food security, as well as a number of the other SDGs. So I think there's an opportunity to link across them and build on some of the presentations we heard about some of those linkages. The second point I would make is that we heard great examples of how research has contributed both fundamental advances that are helping society, as well as targeted solutions to specific problems. And both of those we have good examples for. And it really illustrates the point that was made earlier about it's not an either or basic research or translational research, it's a both and. And so that's just to underscore the importance of that comment, but also the suggestion that we can illustrate that with some of the examples that we heard of. And I believe those give us hope. This is the reason why we need more scientific investment. The final comment I would make is that there is somewhat of a defensive tone in saying if we lose trust in science, we will lose financial support for science. And that is often a basis for criticism of science, that all we care about is money. All we care about is funding for science. And although we know that's not true, it has the tone in here of being we're doing this for ourselves. And so I think we need to be careful about saying loss of trust in science will lead to reduced opportunity for scientific knowledge to help society, to inform societal decisions, et cetera, as well as loss of funding for research. So it's just more balance in terms of who's going to be hearing what we're saying.
Yeah, thank you so much for these comments. And I think we must include in the success story also some issues that you mentioned in your talk. So if you would please add those, including the critical remarks on trust and financing. I think just as a reminder that it can be incorporated. Thank you so much. Directly, yeah, then go, and then we have three more here. Okay.
Yeah, excuse me, just a direct comment on what Jane Lubchenko just said. I mean, if you really look at the reality of funding, think of the European Union. The European Union has a very hard time on agreeing on anything, but what it does agree on is science and technology needs to be fostered. So for the new Commission, the proposal is for the next budget to have 100 billion actually of euro dedicated to research, both basic and applied one, and actually also do it in a mission-driven way, so 35% of that are supposed to be dedicated to climate change, energy, and so on. So there is so much money available, actually. Yeah? We simply need to seize the opportunity. So we shouldn't complain about a sort of a reduction in funding. We should rather seize the opportunity, do the best thing with the funding available. So if there is anything which is sort of a consensus thing in the European Union, it's progress through science and technology.
Thank you. So I think you were next. Yeah.
Just wanted to support very strongly the changes and the additions that Professor Raven and Professor Schellenhuber have suggested for the introduction and actually the last part of the document. I think it's very important to make sure that people understand that we are aware of the urgency of the situation in which we are living at the moment. I think there can be a big dissociation between science and society, which shows actually that although we can push the frontiers of science, we are not taking into account the needs of society. I am still recovering, for example, from the statement of two big pharmaceutical companies that have just announced that they are going to join forces to produce a drug that is going to treat some condition called fatty liver, non-alcoholic fatty liver. That condition is 100% preventable by changes in lifestyle and by diet. The predicted market of such a drug will be about $20 billion, and that is what is dominating that development. If you think that we can make a drug like that, so sophisticated, and which can continue pushing the frontiers of science, and we leave the possibility of solving the problems behind, we are ourselves creating a schism between science and society. I think adding those additions that have been suggested is going to change the nature of the document. In addition, we should make very sure that the statement about the cities comes into the document. If we don't do that, I think the phrase of the meeting will be a phrase that Dr. Chu made in his talk, not in relation to this. It will give the feeling that if we don't change direction, we will end up where we are heading to. And we need to really think about seriously, about the contribution of science in terms of changing direction in many of the things we are doing in order to actually solve some of the fundamental problems that we are confronting.
Thank you very much. Points are taken. They are partly redundant, so I think we have them. Dr. Vicuña.
Well, adding to the previous comments with which I agree, I have a minor suggestion, but I think it's important. It's to make a more explicit mention to the need to respect human dignity when experimenting or applying the novel techniques with humans. It is implicit in the document. For example, there is a sentence at the end of the biology paragraph in page 3 that says, final attention will be called on the necessity of an ethical attitude in the application and use of these spectacular scientific advances. So what I propose is to rephrase, making explicit
the need to respect human dignity. That is my proposition. And then I have another very minor point. The second sentence in that same paragraph says some aspects of these progresses will be discussed in this session. So since this is a statement that...
I have an explanation about that. I was asked to write
No, microphone.
See, we cannot have two microphones on at the same time, so if you turn on, yeah.
I was asked to write some summary about what is going to be happening during the session in biology. And this is why it is with the future verbs. And this has to be corrected.
Simple. I think we can just say some aspects of these progresses were discussed during the plenary
Of course,
session.
but this
As you wish.
This has been corrected here, but the copies have been made before that. It's my fault.
I did not include all the corrections.
You are a gentleman, Vanderlei. It's a detail. It's a detail.
Okay.
So would you agree? Would you all agree on making an explicit mention to the respect to human dignity when experimenting with the new techniques? Okay.
So I have Dr. Cici and then Hassan.
I have just 2 points. One is in the chapter for astronomy and space. Was our Big Bang the only one? Question mark. We cannot say this. We know that there are 3 Big Bangs, and Big Bang 2 has hundreds of laboratories working just now on the problem of Big Bang 2. So we cannot say, was the Big Bang only one? I would like to propose that we make reference to the other Big Bangs. The second point refers to physics. The most fundamental level has established the existence of the subnuclear universe, where new laws allow to understand the structure of the basic constituents of matter and their interactions. We cannot ignore one of the greatest discoveries of this century, the existence of the subnuclear universe. So my proposal is to make these 2 changes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Notes taken. Dr. Hassan.
Thank you very much. Just a couple of observations and suggestions. First of all, I agree with what Peter and Hans have said about the important role of science, technology, and innovation in addressing problems, especially problems that relate to the poor countries. It's just one observation I have that relates to the introduction and the mention of the SDGs. That is number 7 on the science and society. And it says that there is progress in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. But many countries, especially the least developed countries, have not really achieved that much. So I'm wondering whether one can make at least an exception that there are certain countries or certain regions where this progress is not really in place yet. I think this is really very important because one of the key roles of international collaboration and partnership, this is Sustainable Development Goal 17, is to help those countries to go forward to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So I think maybe slight qualification of that might be in place. The second, and that has been emphasized in many of the talks, and that is how you can apply the frontier science and technology and innovation, whether it is in renewable energy, whether it is in CRISPR-Cas9. There is a potential of applying these new and important technologies to solve real-life problems in the poor countries. I think we're seeing hope there. I don't see any of this being expressed. And I think it would be good, for example, renewable energies can play a fundamental role in addressing the energy needs of 70% of the Africans who do not have electricity yet. So perhaps a mention of how important these new technologies can be in addressing some real-life problems in developing countries maybe should be mentioned, because the whole seminar is really about transforming the role of science in society and how basic science and frontier science can actually help to provide solutions to real-life problems in the whole world, but particularly in the poor countries.
Thank you very much. I think what we might be able to do, it was of course impossible in this 2-day symposium or 2.5-day symposium to cover all the important fields where the problems are and where science can contribute. But there were a lot of workshops organized by the Pontifical Academy over the year, and there will be more next year, which will address the problem of energy, of nutrition, and I think there's half a dozen of them. So we might perhaps in our declaration refer to those initiatives where further documents will be available also on strategies to remedy problems. It's true, we did not see this because there were no presentations on these domains. We had a lot of workshops, I think 3 in a row on education for sustainability. So we might simply mention this as a program that is pursued and highlighting the importance that the Academy attributes to these problems. That could perhaps remedy a little bit if we add a paragraph on other activities that we could not thematize during this meeting. Thank you.
Wait, if you want to write a sentence about it. Thank you.
Yeah. Dear Robertis, please.
I quite liked the tone of the initial document, I must say. So congratulations to whoever wrote it. I would not like to see the document become darker and darker, and I think we should have some high points of optimism. In this sense, I'd like to commend Dr. Lubchenko, who was very optimistic in her presentation. So I thought that this was discussed before, but something in ecology and biosystems, something like marine preserves established, I would say, by the United States and Mexico in the Pacific Ocean have had a very positive impact already in maintaining biodiversity and food security, because this is a real development that has happened. It's good for the ocean. So we should put some good things, I think, also. And another one is we have on the penultimate page at the thing, we say development countries need to be actively included in advanced international science systems. Well, I think we had discussions from leaders of science here and how other academies, all the academies can help the developed countries, in charity. That's an activity that people really love, to make science into the poor countries. We had a workshop on that, probably for Latin America, but we could probably take a sentence or two out of that, saying how, science is now so important for the development of society. We only now are realizing that. So that would be a little bit of optimism there on the ocean, a little bit about more on the international thing. And to me, the other optimistic thing was from Dr. Lutz, who said that, the population is now 7.8 billion and it's going to go to 9 billion or something, but then it's going to decrease if we educate women. That was the idea.
Yeah.
And I think we don't have that right now. So,
yeah.
So the importance of educating women and maybe the internet, that is going to give us, and I think the internet is what's going to give us the ability to read and write to everybody. So, the telephones and great technological advances. I'd like to see a little bit more of optimism also. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Would you mind, just as a reminder for us, I take notes, but just send us the 3 bullet points: education of women, academies, do something for the third world. Obviously, all of the scientific disciplines have now international organizations that run summer schools, that go there, that teach. Yeah. Okay. So, Antonio?
Well, thank you for this enormous work. I will only add one word. And when we speak about climate change energy, we say many solutions are still available to avert catastrophic impacts. This is very important. I will only add, including mass migration, which is a catastrophic result of climate change too. Only that.
Yeah. Yes.
On the mass migration issue, just as a factual matter, the data we have on mass migrations is that the total phenomenon is driven by a wide range of activities, mostly war and civil unrest. Climate change is an amplifier of that. We would look foolish to many people with expertise in this area to be linking all or most of the mass migration happening now or even in the future solely to climate change. Climate change certainly as an aggravator and amplifier, but not as the sole cause. Just a matter of grounding us in the data.
Sheilnova?
Yeah. Just to, first of all, I support your proposal. And of course, I agree with Bill Clark on this is one of the many complex issues we are dealing with. Even biodiversity loss is not just a question of timber sort of trade and things like that, we know that. But actually it turns out, because I worked in the field of maybe climate-induced migration, we published in PNS on that, it simply turns out, if you look at the evidence, that if you have more extreme events which have an impact on the economy in a country, when this will actually lead to migration and even armed conflict, if, for example, you have a high ethnical divide already in a country. So in the Sudan, Mohammed, where you have this ethnical divide, or in Syria, as we have seen, when a drought is actually triggering the conflict, if you have a country which is very homogeneous, say Japan, when an extreme event, even the Fukushima accident has not created armed conflict, of course, because you have a very homogeneous culture. But if you have dividing lines already, as we have across Africa, for example, when climate change can trigger actually this mass migration. So we have a body of evidence on that.
Yeah, Stephen Chu.
I just want to support that. Right now, it's a mixture of things, but if you look towards 20, 30, 40 years from today, we will be in a very different situation, that it would be considered, perhaps, unfortunately, the major driver. And I think that's what the concern is about. And beyond that, 100 years from today, even more so.
Yeah, thank you. Just a logistic comment. For those who are willing to write bullet points, brief paragraphs, send them to PAS.
Yeah, send it to pas@pas.va, which is the official email of the Academy, and we're going to collect and implement everything, okay? So I'm going to repeat. Is that the same one that you've been receiving message? pas@pas.va. Thank you.
Thank you. As soon as possible.
Before lunch? Well, as soon as possible, because we wanted to leave tomorrow, maybe at most, so we can leave the document behind.
So if there are no further hands, I read that you would like to have a brief walk in the gardens before we have lunch, and you sit down and write those who volunteered.
No, I think they should stay and work in the text so we can get done. We have 1 hour, so we should do it.
So we have 1 hour, but do you feel that we have discussed what we needed to discuss? Then thank you very much for your contributions. And please send in your comments as fast as possible. And we'll see each other again at lunchtime. Dr. Carey?
May I just come back on science education? Mr. President, I think you mentioned that the text would appear on science education. Did you say that? Did you speak of a paragraph? Which
We said we would.
So there will be a paragraph on science education?
Yeah.
Okay.
But you're welcome to formulate something if you like and send it in
I see.
right now.
It will not be forgotten.
Yeah.
Wolf?
I repeat my thanks.
Wolf, I have a question over here.
Yes, sorry.
When we all received an invitation to this event, there was mention that the papers would be published. Can someone give us an update on whether that is still the plan or if there have been some changes, just so that we all are aware? Some people have turned in papers, many have not. Could you just clarify for us?
Yeah, I'm not competent to do this, but Marcello should know. Because this has been orchestrated by Joachim and then he dropped out.
We are the decision of the Council to publish all in the new way, open access, in the internet, but also in the traditional way, a book. So, but we need the text. The great problem is to have the text, because people with the PowerPoint not are able to have a redaction, traditional redaction of the papers. So we need the text. In the contrary, it's impossible to publish if we don't have the text, because it's not enough to have a text in PowerPoint. This is all the problem. Thank you very much. So I wait for the text.
Can I say I agree completely with this proposition, and those of you who may have not had yet a manuscript in detail, sometimes going back home, one don't remember precisely. So I think the Academy has made recordings, and if you think you like to have that, you just contact the Academy and you will receive it.
Yes, I would like to add that our last two plenary sessions were not published as books. So I sent 2 papers to those. So I think you should make a retrospective book, putting even the old ones, like the ones I have sent. But for example, I would really want to see Werner's paper published on paper. These things are permanent, and so many of you have already written papers and have brought them here, so they should be published not only in the internet, where our talks come out with the paper underneath, but they should be actually published as a book, I think, because that has a great influence. It goes to libraries, and it's a permanent record.
No, sorry. We are publish all the books that we have the text. We don't have all the text. We publish in PowerPoint the text that we have, waiting for the other text. So we have your text, but not all the text. So this is the problem. And you know perfectly one complicated is to have the text, because you organize the meeting of the Latin American authors, and because you insist, we have the text and we can publish the book. So you can check. All the things that we have, we publish. And if we have only the records, we have the records. So. Yes, it's true. After the lunch, we have the closed session. So this is the moment to thank to all people to come to this very important plenary session, especially that are not academicians. Thank you very much. And really, we are very thankful for your collaboration and your participation. In the name of the President, on behalf of the President, we are very, very grateful and thanks. And of course, we wait for your text to be to publish the text. Thank you very much.